On June 30, 1956, two commercial airliners with 128 people aboard vanished over Arizona in broad daylight. And the reason why will make you rethink everything about how we track aircraft. It's 10:31 in the morning, June 30, 1956. A Lockheed Constellation named the TWA Flight 2 is cruising at 21,000 feet over the Grand Canyon. Below, the Colorado River cuts through red rock like a scar. The pilots, experienced men in their 40s, have filed a flight plan. Air traffic control knows exactly where they are, or thinks they do. Then, at almost the same altitude, a Douglas DC-7 operated by United Airlines descends into the same patch of sky. Same time, same place, different flight plan. Nobody sees it coming. There's no radar. There's no collision avoidance system. There's just air traffic control on the ground, armed with pencils and paper strips, trying to keep mental track of invisible metal tubes moving at 300 miles per hour through three-dimensional space. The system works fine when everyone follows the rules. But rules, as we'll see, are only as good as the men interpreting them. Let me back up. In the 1950s, commercial aviation was booming. Jet engines were getting better. Planes were faster, could fly higher, carry more passengers, but the infrastructure to manage all this speed and altitude that hadn't caught up yet. Air traffic control was still largely a visual and radio-based operation. Controllers worked with what we'd now call a crude system, pilot reports, flight plans filed hours in advance, and educated guesses about where everyone actually was. The TWA Constellation that morning carried 70 passengers and a crew of 6. The United DC-7 carried 58 passengers and a crew of 6, together 128 people. Most were headed to California, routine business travelers, families visiting relatives, the kind of passengers who didn't think twice about the safety of their flight. Why would they? Aviation had a decent safety record. Accidents happened, sure, but they were rare. The TWA Flight originated in New York. The United Flight came from Chicago. Both were headed to Los Angeles. Both had filed flight plans. Both had been cleared by air traffic control. But here's the thing, and this is the detail that haunted investigators for years. The flight plans didn't account for something crucial: wind drift. At altitude, planes drift north or south depending on the jet stream. The paperwork didn't really factor that in with precision. Both planes were also trying to climb to higher altitude. The TWA pilot had requested 21,000 feet. The United pilot was climbing toward the same level. Controllers on the ground cleared both of them, assuming, and this is critical, that the pilots would maintain visual separation. In other words, they were relying on the pilots to see each other and stay apart. A reasonable assumption on a clear day. Except the Grand Canyon, for all its beauty, is a lousy place to spot another aircraft. At 10:35 a.m., the two planes collided head-on. The impact was catastrophic. The TWA Constellation's right wing sheared clean off. The DC-7 was torn apart. Both aircraft disintegrated in the sky, falling in pieces across the canyon floor and surrounding terrain. All 128 people aboard were killed instantly. It remains, to this day, the deadliest aviation accident in history at that time. But nobody knew it yet. The planes simply vanished from radar screens and radio contact. Controllers waited, they called out, nothing came back. Hours passed, rescue teams were mobilized, search and rescue aircraft fanned out across Arizona. The wreckage wasn't discovered until the next day, scattered across remote canyon terrain. What they found was a crime scene, though not the criminal kind, a systemic failure frozen in twisted aluminum. The investigation that followed was meticulous. The Civil Aeronautics Board, the precursor to the NTSB, sent investigators to the scene. They reconstructed the flight paths. They interviewed air traffic controllers. They examined the wreckage for clues. And slowly the picture became clear. This wasn't pilot error. It wasn't mechanical failure. It was a systems failure, a collision between two planes that shouldn't have been in the same airspace at the same time. The problem came down to this. Air traffic control was operating on assumptions that no longer held true. Planes were faster and flew higher than before. The system of visual separation, relying on pilots to see each other, was becoming obsolete. Wind drift wasn't being calculated precisely enough. Controllers had no way to know exactly where aircraft were in three-dimensional space. They had a two-dimensional mental map and hoped it was accurate. The irony, and it's a bitter one, is that the solution already existed. Radar technology had been refined during World War II. Some airports had it, but it wasn't widely deployed. The infrastructure to use it effectively, to coordinate between multiple radar sites, to integrate that data into real-time air traffic management, that didn't exist yet. The Grand Canyon collision happened in the gap between old technology and new. It was a tragedy born of transition. The CAB's final report, issued months later, was damning but not accusatory. Nobody had done anything wrong technically. Both pilots had followed procedure. Controllers had followed procedure, but the procedure itself was inadequate. The report recommended sweeping changes: mandatory radar at major airports, improved communication protocols, better altitude separation standards, and crucially, a shift away from relying on visual separation in busy airspace. Those recommendations took years to implement. The Federal Aviation Administration, created in 1958, just 2 years after the Grand Canyon collision, incorporated many of them. Radar became standard, communication protocols were standardized. The whole infrastructure of air traffic control was rebuilt from the ground up, piece by piece, driven largely by this single catastrophe. What strikes me most standing here in front of these documents is how invisible the problem was until it wasn't. The system worked fine most of the time. Thousands of flights happened without incident. Then on one clear morning over Arizona, the invisible became catastrophic. The 128 people who died that day never knew they were in danger. To them, it was just another flight. The Grand Canyon collision forced aviation to grow up. It forced the industry to stop assuming that human eyes and radio calls were enough to keep planes apart. It created a framework, radar, standardized procedures, redundant systems that became the model for safe aviation worldwide. Every flight you take today in some small way exists because of what went wrong that day. The wreckage was eventually cleared from the canyon. The families of the victims were notified, the names were recorded, and the aviation industry moved forward carrying the lesson with it. Progress without systems is just momentum toward disaster. Safety isn't something you achieve once and then forget about. It's something you build, test, and rebuild again and again, learning from every close call and every tragedy. Subscribe for more stories like this one, cases where a single moment exposed a flaw in the system, and where that exposure changed everything. Subscribe for more stories like this one, cases where a single moment exposed a flaw in the system, and where that exposure changed everything.